In 1868, the western sky lay heavy with ash-gray clouds. Dust from the Oregon Trail rose in restless swirls, dimming the last light of day. Maren Johnson dragged her weary steps across the vast emptiness, her shoes worn to ruin, each stride burning her feet raw. Her fingers bled, scratched by thorns and jagged stone. Hunger gnawed at her belly, yet the ache in her spirit cut deeper still. She was the lone survivor of a raider's attack on the wagon train. For 3 days she had fled, hiding, clinging to life with nothing but stubborn will. In the small cloth satchel she carried, one relic remained, a silver locket etched with the faces of her parents, the only proof she had once belonged to a family. Each time she faltered, she clutched it tight, forcing herself onward. A low rise appeared ahead. Her legs trembled, but she pressed upward. At the crest, her vision blurred, yet in the distance a spark of light broke the horizon. Maren blinked hard, refusing to believe it was real. A ranch house, its oil lamp glowing like a single flame against the night. To her, it seemed more phantom than truth. "No, it can't be," she rasped. Voice cracked, throat parched as dust. But in her despair, she chose to believe, and staggered toward the vision. She saw a horse corral, sturdy beams of a cabin, and a tall man leading his horse to water. She tried to call out, but only a hoarse hiss left her lips. Her arm lifted, then failed. Just short of the fence, her knees buckled, her body crumpling to the earth. The sound of her fall rang in her ears like thunder. Consciousness slipped, yet through the haze came the heavy thud of boots, urgent and sure. A man's voice broke through, low and steady. "Can you hear me? Are you alive?" Strong hands turned her gently. Maren forced her eyes open, glimpsing a sun-browned face, a high bridge of nose, and eyes the color of deep water filled with concern. No scorn, no distance. Only the raw urgency of one soul fighting for another's. "Water," she whispered, lips cracked. Without pause, the man bent low, slid his arm beneath her, and lifted her clean off the ground. She weighed no more than a bundle of kindling in his arms. His calloused hand pressed against her frozen skin, and warmth seeped in, making her shiver. "Hold on. I'll get you inside. You're safe here." The words fell over her like a rope cast into the pit, pulling her back from the edge. For a heartbeat, Maren let herself rest against his chest, hearing the steady thrum of his heart. Before darkness claimed her once more, the last thing she saw was the certainty in his gaze, blue, solemn, unyielding, the eyes of Gideon Hayes, master of the ranch, and the only salvation left in her broken world. A wavering gold light flickered across rough-hewn walls, cast by the oil lamp hung low on a wooden shelf. Maren Johnson opened her eyes with the shock of one returned from the grave. Her breath came hard, chest tight, unable to believe she still drew air. A heavy quilt lay across her body, the faint scent of soap drifting in the air. She blinked fast, trying to take in the unfamiliar room. A low ceiling, plank walls sanded smooth, an old trunk in the corner, and a neat stack of folded shirts on a chair. Her throat burned dry, her head spun. She tried to sit, but her body felt carved from stone. At the first stir of movement, a broad hand pressed gently on her shoulder, firm yet careful. "Not yet," a low voice said. She turned her head. In the lamp's glow, his face took shape, sun-darkened skin, jaw rough with stubble, short brown hair tousled loose. His eyes, deep blue as still water, watched her with a guarded worry. He held a tin cup to her lips. "Water," he murmured. Her hand trembled, but had no strength. He bent close, his calloused palm steadying her as he lifted the cup, guiding the cool stream over her cracked lips. The water slid down her throat, stinging with relief. A drop spilled, tracing her chin. With a worn handkerchief, he wiped it away, slow, deliberate, so gentle her heart skipped. "You're safe now," he said, his voice carrying a warmth that steadied her. "Rest." "I'll see to everything else," her words rasped, broken. "Where am I?" "Hayes Ranch," he answered plain. 40 miles southwest of Fort Laramie. Name's Gideon Hayes. Found you fainted by the fence line." His name echoed in her mind, carved like a marker. She lowered her gaze. In his eyes there was no mockery, no measure, only an honest worry. That truth alone tightened her chest. She had known enough contempt in the East, where skin decided worth, to know the weight of such regard. She drew the quilt closer, cheeks burning. Her dress hung in tatters, dirt-stained and torn. The thought of her ruin laid bare before a stranger bound her throat shut. Gideon seemed to catch it in her eyes. He was silent, then reached for a gray shirt folded neat on the chair. He set it by the bed. "Wear this." "You'll be easier," he rose, tall and steady as a wall against wind. At the door, he paused, his voice quiet but sure. "There's no need to fear here." The door closed, leaving stillness broken only by wind through the cracks. Maren clutched the quilt tight, heart racing. Tears rose, not from pain, but from something else. For the first time since terror began, she was seen without judgment. She slipped into the shirt, lowered her feet to the wooden floor. Pain throbbed in her soles, yet the frozen numbness had lifted. The room was plain, but kept, every detail marked by the order of a man alone. The door opened once more. Gideon stepped in with a tray, set it on the bedside table, a bowl of thin soup, a few slices of dry bread. Steam curled and hunger twisted in her belly. "Eat. It's not much, but it'll hold you." Her lips formed thanks, but only a nod came. She reached, trembling. He steadied her again, patient, spoon by spoon. Between them, silence filled the room, clink of metal, wind outside, and the pounding of her own heart. When the bowl was bare, he sat back in the chair, never looking away. "What's your name?" "Maren," she whispered. "Maren Johnson." His face softened a shade. "Keep your strength, Maren. You'll need sleep tonight. Tomorrow we'll talk." He moved to rise, but she reached and caught the sleeve of his rough shirt. The sudden act startled even herself. Her fingertips brushed the muscle beneath, a strange jolt running through her frame. "Thank you," she breathed, voice breaking. "I've nothing to give, but I won't be a burden. I'll work." His eyes lowered, shadowed not by anger, but pity he could not hide. He gave a slight nod. "We'll speak of that once you're strong. For now, rest." He eased her hand away, yet his gaze held hers a beat longer. In that moment, Maren felt her fear unravel, replaced by something fragile, untried, a glimmer of hope. The door closed again, his steps fading down the hall. Maren lay back, drawing the quilt close. Her body still trembled, but for the first time in many nights, she felt sleep would come. Outside, the prairie wind cried over the plains, but in the room the lamp burned steady, a small flame standing guard over the rest of a soul just pulled back from the edge. On the first morning, Maren found the strength to stand. Gideon was out saddling a horse. He told her they were riding to Riverbend. She needed proper clothes. What hung from her frame could not carry her through another day. "No need," Maren whispered, clutching the thin blanket like a shield. "I don't want to trouble you." "You're no trouble," Gideon answered flat, "but you can't last in rags. Cold's coming." She knew he was right. The western chill showed no mercy. Yet the thought of him spending coin on her weighed heavy. But when she caught his eyes, blue, steady, she understood there was no ground for argument. Moments later, she was astride behind him, gripping the saddle, her heart pounding not only from the jolt of the trail. Riverbend appeared as a smear of brown in the haze. Wagon ruts scarred the main road. A line of shops, general store, saloon, tailor, and a small church, ran its length. When Gideon reined in, curious eyes turned. Maren lowered her head, heart tightening. She had known those eyes back east, probing, judging, sometimes cruel. No words here, only whispers carried sharp as needles. "Come on," Gideon said, his steady hand guiding her down. His glance cut the crowd cool, enough to turn a few stares aside. Inside the tailor's, the matron hesitated at the sight of Maren. But Gideon's tone was firm, unbending. At his word, she measured, jotted notes, laid out fabric. Maren stood still, fingers knotted, uneasy at the thought of fine cloth laid for her, bought by a stranger. On the ride back, silence held. Gideon's back loomed broad, a shield against the wind. The town's eyes lingered in her mind, yet strange to her, there was little scorn, mostly curiosity. Stranger still, within her grew a resolve. She would not be his burden. That evening at the ranch, she faced him in the kitchen. "I will work," she said, her voice steadier than she expected. "Cooking, washing, tending chickens, whatever needs done. I cannot sit idle and feed off your kindness." Gideon frowned, wiping his hands on a cloth. "You're still weak. A strong gust could lay you flat." "I won't live on pity," Maren returned, dark eyes lit firm. "Let me keep my dignity." Their eyes locked. His face softened, a sigh breaking through. "All right. But start light. If you push yourself under, I won't forgive it." Her lips curved faint, the first smile in many days. "Then we have an accord." The days after took on new rhythm. Maren rose early, fumbling in the kitchen. When she mishandled the worn knife, Gideon paused, adjusting her grip. His rough hand closed around hers, warm, steady, sending her heart into a startled beat. By afternoon, she was at the wash, her raw hands trembling in the cold water. Gideon passed, his eyes lingering on the cracked skin. But he said nothing, only hauled water without a word. Another time, near stumbling with a heavy basin, she found herself caught at him, the waist, pulled back into his arms before she fell. His breath brushed her hair, hot, and their eyes locked too near. Flustered, she stepped away, cheeks burning. Gideon gave only a nod, turning off as though nothing had passed. Yet in her chest, the echo beat strong. Evenings they shared the kitchen, she cooking, he washing dishes. the quiet filled with clink of spoon against pot, the hush of water running. Now and then their hands brushed in passing a plate or spoon, each time both stilled, then carried on. But the silence after lingered, charged with something unnamed. One night, with the fire sinking low, Maren sat sewing on the settee. Gideon across from her, book in hand. Lamplight stretched their shadows long on the wall. At times she looked up, catching his gaze. He would glance down quickly, but she knew. And inside her, something stirred. Warm, frightening. She knew now she had chosen to stay, and not for pride alone. There was another reason, hard to speak, but clear as the steady fall of his footsteps in the hall, the bend of his frame at work outdoors, or the way his eyes lingered a moment too long on her. Maren understood. She was no longer only fighting to live. She was learning, for the first time, what it meant to belong. In the early days of October, when ranch work had become more familiar, Maren sat at the wooden table by the window with a clean sheet of paper. Gideon came in from the barn and saw her with a pen. "Are you going to write a letter?" he asked, even-voiced. Maren nodded slightly. "I need to tell my aunt in Boston. She must think I'm dead." He said nothing more, only set an envelope and a fresh inkwell on the table. "I'll have someone in town send it." Maren smiled, a small comfort settling in her. She bent her head and wrote a few plain lines. She had escaped, was staying temporarily at a ranch owned by a decent man, and asked Aunt Charlotte not to worry. The words were short, restrained. She knew that if she told everything, her aunt's worry would only grow. 2 weeks later, an answer arrived. Gideon placed the letter on the kitchen table while she stoked the fire. "There's mail for you," he said simply. Maren wiped her hands on her apron and opened the envelope carefully. Her Aunt Charlotte's familiar handwriting tightened her chest. The letter was not long, but each line carried concern. Her aunt was glad she was alive but urged her to return to Boston as soon as possible. She stressed the West's dangers and reminded Maren that, as a woman of color, she would never find a true place there. Maren folded the letter and sat in silence. Her heart was in knots. That night she could not sleep. Wind pushed at the window shutters. In the dark, Maren turned over the 2 paths in her mind. Boston. There was a home, kin, and safety. But that safety came with chains. She would slip back into the familiar role. A woman pushed to the margins, bearing whispers and cold stares. The West harsh, full of peril, able to take life without warning. Yet here she had a feeling she had never known. Work to do. The chance to stand on her own feet. And more than that, a man who had saved her and looked at her as a person, not a color. She hugged the pillow, the thought of leaving Gideon stabbing her chest. The next morning, at the table, Maren set the letter down. "My aunt wants me to go back to Boston," she said quietly. Gideon looked up. His blue eyes met her face, then slid away. "And what do you want?" Maren bit her lip. "I know. It would be safer there. But—" She inhaled. "Here, I feel free. I have never felt this before," silence stretched, broken only by the clink of a spoon. Gideon gave a small nod, his voice slow. "I cannot decide for you. Just choose what makes you happy." The words were plain, but his hand tightened on the cup until the knuckles paled. His gaze avoided hers. A tremor flickered through him. In that instant, Maren saw it. His fear was not the land itself. but the thought that she might leave him. That afternoon, Maren sat on the porch with the folded letter in her dress pocket. Before her, the fields burned gold. In the distance, Gideon led a horse beneath the bright sun. Wind slapped her cheek, but inside her something rose. Resolve. In Boston, she would be a shadow. Here she was, Maren, a person with working hands and a heart beating for something larger than fear. She drew a deep breath, and for the first time since the attack, the corners of her mouth lifted into a thin smile. The choice remained unspoken, but in her heart she had already chosen the road she would walk. At first, when Maren appeared at Gideon's side in town, folks only whispered a little before letting it drop. Everyone knew she had survived a trail tragedy and had been taken in by a decent man. In their eyes, it was charity, nothing worth further talk. But as weeks turned, people noticed she never left Hayes Ranch. Curious glances sharpened, whispers stretched longer. Soon the talk was that a colored woman living under the same roof as a white bachelor could only breed scandal. Maren felt it most one morning when she and Gideon rode down for salt and flour. Stepping into the general store, the air faltered. A housewife at the pastry counter pressed her lips and muttered to her friend. A man tipped his hat to Gideon, but when his gaze slid to Maren, it turned cold, brows raised. She lowered her eyes, fingers clutching her skirt, heart pinched tight. All the old ghosts from Boston crowded back. Whispers, scornful looks, the certainty she would never belong. Now it rose again, only on Western soil. On the ride home, she sat behind Gideon, silent, the wind sharp against her face. But it did not clear her throat of the lump. She feared not for herself, but that Gideon might bear shame for her sake. At the gate she spoke at last. Perhaps I should find another place. If I stay, they'll keep talking. Gideon stripped the saddle, led the horse in, tying it fast. Only then did he turn, blue eyes fixed deep. My name can stand it, Maren. I've lived with folks talk before. His voice dropped. What I fear is they'll harm you. The words landed on her chest like a soft hand pressed deep. She could not answer, her throat closed, so she turned away, hiding the tears that welled. A week later, Gideon brought his solution. That afternoon, as Maren hung laundry, he came near. I've had a thought, he said. There's a widow, Mrs. Whitaker. Her son's gone east. She's looking for quieter ground. I mean to ask her to live here with us. Maren froze, the cloth in her hands dripping. You'd do that for me? For both of us, Gideon said, his tone even, but his eyes steady as stone. With her here, tongues will rest. And you'll have another woman to speak with. I can't always be near her, face lowered, heat rising within, part shame, part warmth. In his plain words, she heard it clear. Protection, given without boast, without demand. He neither pushed her out nor shrank from the rumors. He faced them for her. A week later, Mrs. Whitaker arrived in a small wagon with a few trunks. She was near 50, stout, her gray hair pinned high. From the start, she was frank. Miss Johnson, I don't care what folks say. I lived back east. I know what wagging tongues can do. But here, if you and Mr. Hayes treat me square, then this is my home too. Agreed? Maren smiled faint, a weight lifting. Agreed. Thank you. From that night on, the ranch changed. Supper hours no longer echoed with just the crackle of fire, but with Mrs. Whitaker's gravelly stories, sharp remarks that often drew reluctant laughter from both Maren and Gideon. In town, the rumors dimmed. A widow on the ranch gave no cause for scandal. That night, when the house lay still, Maren stood on the porch watching moonlight sweep the fields. Gideon came out, wordless at her side. "You didn't have to do all this," she said softly. "I did," he answered. "If a simple measure can give you peace, why wouldn't I?" Maren turned to him, her eyes meeting his. Beneath the calm of his voice, she saw something deeper. Care he never named, but carried in every act. Her heart quivered. The night wind was sharp, yet she felt warm all through. By late summer afternoon, the sky turned with a speed that warned of danger. Maren and Gideon had just finished checking the herd in the far pasture when black clouds piled heavy overhead. The wind howled, lifting dust in choking swirls. Gideon glanced upward, his eyes narrowing. "There's an old shack nearby." "We'll take shelter there," he called above the rising gale. Maren only managed a nod before they spurred their horses. Thunder cracked like cannon fire. Lightning split the heavens white. By the time they reached the weathered shack near a stand of trees, rain poured in sheets. They dragged the horses beneath the overhang and rushed inside. The shack was bare. One narrow cot, a rusted iron stove in the corner, and a few scraps of wood. Wind shrieked through the gaps, but it kept the storm at bay. Maren stood trembling, her thin dress plastered to her frame, water running down her arms. She hugged herself for warmth. Gideon turned aside, pulled off his long coat, then stepped close to drape it across her shoulders. "You'll catch your death," he said quietly. She looked up, meeting the deep blue of his eyes, steady, restrained. Her throat closed around the words of thanks, so she only nodded. Gideon set a fire in the stove. The weak flame took, then flared, throwing glow across the cramped room. Maren sank near it, pulling the coat close, breathing the scent of leather and pine. His scent. For a long while they sat in silence, rain hammering the roof. Then Gideon spoke, his voice low. "I grew up in Missouri. My father died in the mines. I left it all, came west with nothing but my hands. Worked till I carved out this land." His tone was steady, but loss shadowed the edges. Maren lowered her gaze to the fire. "My father was a teacher in Philadelphia. He believed knowledge could change the world. My mother worried, yet followed him west. I believed in his dream too, until the day—" her voice broke. "Until the day they were gone," Gideon finished for her, his voice dropping. She nodded, tears sliding free. In the firelight he watched her, then laid a rough hand lightly on hers. The touch tested, tentative. She should have pulled back, yet her fingers trembled and twined into his. In that small act, years of loneliness and grief found an answering echo. He drew nearer, the warmth of his hand spreading through her cold body. They sat close, storm raging outside, but in the shack the distance between them closed. Firelight glimmered off the drops still clinging to her hair. Their breaths mingled in the tight air. Gideon's voice was almost lost to the rain. "Maren, I wonder if you feel what I feel now." Her heart jolted, but she held his gaze. After a breath, her voice came soft as wind. "Yes, Gideon." He bent down. The first brush of lips was cautious, fragile, as though the moment might shatter. But when she did not turn away, the kiss deepened. fierce with all the words left unspoken. The coat slipped from her shoulders to the floorboards. His arm drew her tight to his chest. She trembled, not from the draft through the walls, but from a fire kindled within. "I've held this back too long," he whispered, his voice rough against her ear. She closed her eyes, answering with her own touch. Her hands found his shoulders, traced the hard lines beneath the thin, rain-damp shirt. Each breath, each trembling press of lips, carried the truth. Neither was alone anymore. That night in the broken shack, they gave themselves to one another. Not with haste, not with force, but with the gentleness of two battered souls finding a home. Every look, every embrace spoke that life still stirred and love still burned. Outside, rain pounded the roof. Inside, their hearts beat unguarded, unhidden. When the storm eased, they lay together on the narrow cot. Maren pressed her cheek to Gideon's shoulder, listening to the steady rhythm of his heart like a vow. Her own heartbeat slowed, eased of its old fear. Gideon's arm wrapped her close. His murmur meant only for her. "You're not alone anymore, Maren." She let tears fall, tears of release, not grief. Beyond the walls, the storm broke apart, and within, another storm stilled as well, the long, lonely tempest of their hearts. The morning after the storm, sunlight lay soft across the prairie, erasing the soaked traces of a long night. On the road back to the ranch, Maren rode Daisy with her back straight, eyes fixed on the mare's wet mane. Loose strands of damp hair clung to her cheek, stirred by the breeze. Beside her, Gideon sat astride Thunderbolt, silent as a great oak. His shoulders were set hard, the reins drawn tight in his hand until his knuckles whitened. They rode side by side, yet it felt as though a whole stretch of prairie stood between them. No words, no glances. What had passed in the shack still burned hot in memory, yet now it hung like a secret not yet given a name. At the ranch, Maren slipped quickly into the kitchen. She hung the sodden coat, lit the stove, the firelight painting her face in orange glow. Her cheeks burned, not from the heat, but from the storm of confusion within. She chopped onions with a trembling hand, the knife clicking unevenly against the board. Out in the yard, Gideon led the horses into the stalls, busying himself with bridles and straps. He rubbed leather raw, tightened knots again and again, as though labor might drown the images still sharp in his mind. Maren pressed against him, the heat of her lips answering his, the look in her eyes beneath the flicker of flame. Breakfast came in a silence taut as wire. Maren set cornbread and salted pork on the table. Gideon gave a short nod, a hushed "thank you," then bent over his plate. They never met eyes for long, yet each stolen glance sent the heart quickening before retreating again. The days after slid back into rhythm. Gideon rode the range. Maren tended kitchen, laundry, and garden. Yet the air carried a thin layer, compressed, sweet, and tense all at once. Maren noticed. Whenever she dozed off by the fire, a blanket was always pulled over her by morning. She never asked, but her heart knew whose hand had done it. And Gideon, each evening he returned sunburned and weary, always found his favorite stew waiting, spiced beef and beans with cornbread crisp at the side. Maren never said a word, but she remembered. He never admitted, yet never left it untouched. They avoided long talk, avoided calling each other by name, Yet every small act became a whispered word. Mrs. Whitaker, her needles clicking by the window, saw it all. She smiled faint when neighbor children played by the fence, but her eyes missed nothing. Gideon's gaze lingering too long, Maren's hand trembling when pouring his coffee, the sudden silences that made supper heavy yet tender. She said nothing. She knew some things required time to weave their own pattern. One evening, the moon washed silver across the fields. Gideon sat on the porch, a cigarette burning low between his fingers, eyes far away. Maren stepped out, carrying folded quilts. Moonlight traced her face, her eyes glistening, as if veiled in mist. Gideon turned quickly aside, afraid his heart would show. "It's a fair night," Maren said softly, her voice trembling. "Yeah," he answered, husky. They stood close, both silent. Maren heard her own heartbeat thundering, louder than the crickets in the grass. The space was but an arm's reach, yet it felt as wide as the wild frontier. Day by day, she learned to live with that silence. It was not avoidance. It was a taut cord binding them both. Each morning when Gideon saddled his horse, she tucked a small packet of biscuits into his hand, feigning casual. Each night, as she sewed under lamplight, he paused in passing, long enough to be sure the light was strong for her eyes. No touch, no words, yet enough to stir her soul. Once, when she drew a bucket from the well, the rope slipped. The pail nearly fell, but Gideon's hand caught it at the same moment as hers. His rough skin brushed her slender fingers. Both froze. Their eyes met, stormed with feeling neither could voice. Maren pulled away, her cheeks burning. Gideon turned aside, busying with the rope, but in their hearts they both knew. This fragile distance could not last forever. From the porch, Mrs. Whitaker watched, her smile faint and wise. In her gaze was the quiet knowledge of one who had seen 100 silent courtships. She knew well enough, given time, this silence would turn into a promise neither could deny. That dawn burned bright. Gold spread like honey across the prairie. Cows bellowed across the fields. Horses snorted and pawed. Ropes cracked crisp in the air. The ranch moved with an uncommon stir. Gideon, with Miguel and Thomas, readied for the long run up to Cheyenne, to the region's big cattle market. Maren stood on the porch steps, clutching the soap-scented cloth, eyes following his shape among the stock. Morning light picked out his broad shoulders, showed each sure, forceful motion, cinching the reins, hauling the iron gate, signaling the herd onward. Now and then he looked up, his glance sweeping the yard and catching hers for a brief instant. The instant tightened Maren's chest. In the noisy cadence of morning, she realized she had never imagined the moment he would leave. For so long, the ranch had equaled Gideon in her mind. Seeing him prepare to go, she felt the hollow that was waiting to open. When the work neared done, Gideon halted at the porch, sweat beading his brow, hair dark and damp with sun. He stopped before her, voice low but clear. "When I return, will you still be here?" The question choked her. Many times she had told herself she was only staying for now, that sooner or later she would seek another place. Now the words would not come. She pressed her lips together, then nodded, a faint smile touching her mouth. He nodded as if that answered enough. No embrace, no kiss, only a look held longer than usual, quietly full of things unsaid. Then he turned and merged with the moving line of men and cattle. Horses' feet and herders' shouts faded, dust rolled up in a blanket. Maren watched until their shapes vanished at the horizon. Only then did the fear rise, the fear of losing him, the fear that a separation might never be mended. Ranch life folded back into its ordinary rhythm, but without Gideon, everything felt oddly hollow. In the mornings, Maren still built the fire and set out plates for those who remained. Yet when she set a plate on the table, she would prepare an extra portion by habit, then stare at the empty chair at the head of the table and feel a sharp ache. She threw herself into work harder than before. By day, she hung laundry, tended the fowl, watered the garden, even helped Miguel mend a broken fence line out in the fields. At night, she sewed by lamplight, eyes burning but hands steady. Whenever her hands lagged, his memory flooded her, the short laugh, the steady hand on the reins, the calm gaze that seemed to hold the sky. Once at the well, she saw her lonely figure mirrored in the dark water. She flinched at how quiet the yard had become. No heavy footsteps at the barn, no silhouette at sunset on the far field. Only the wind moving through the prairie and the hollow in her chest remained. Night found her in the small bed alone. Cold crept through the window cracks, and she remembered the blanket Gideon had quietly laid over her when she fell asleep by the stove. She drew the covering up to her chin, but the emptiness pressed on. One evening, as she stitched by the hearth, Mrs. Whitaker sat opposite, her keen eyes watching. At last she spoke, voice rough but warm. "Child, I have lived long enough to learn this. Love matters more than what folks think." Maren lifted her head, bit her lip, about to argue. Mrs. Whitaker would not let her. "I see the way Gideon looks at you," the widow went on, her eyes fixed on Maren's face. "That look is not the same he gives to anyone else. And you look at him the same." The needle slipped from Maren's hand and clattered to the floor. She stooped to retrieve it, fingers trembling. Mrs. Whitaker's voice softened. "Stop hiding from yourself. You have lost too much already to refuse your own happiness." Maren gripped the needle tight and could not answer. Her heart raced. In the lamplight, she saw herself in those recent days, cleaning the kitchen to hope he would come home, cooking stew because she knew he liked it, standing on the porch watching the dusty road. That night she stood long at the bedroom window, looking out across the dark field. In the dark she ceased the self-deceit. In a whisper she admitted to herself, "I have loved him." On the 12th day, as sunset poured red across the horizon, Maren stood at the same porch, eyes fixed on the dust-streaked road. She no longer pretended to be strong. Now she knew the deepest fear was not the town's gaze, nor the harshness of the West. The fear was simple: losing him. She drew a long breath and clenched her hands together. In the quiet wind, her private plea rose like a vow. "Hurry back, Gideon. I remain here, waiting for you." That evening, the last light of day poured gold across the prairie. Maren knelt in the garden, hands stained with soil, a willow basket beside her filled with ripe tomatoes. Sweat beaded her brow, strands of damp hair clinging to her neck. Hoofbeats came faint at first, carried on the wind, then clearer, urgent, familiar. Maren's head lifted, her heart thundering. Down the dusted road, a drove of cattle and riders emerged. At the front, Gideon rode, coat coated with trail dust, face darkened by sun, but his eyes flared bright when they found her in the garden. He reined in and called out, "Maren!" Her name rang through her chest. Her hands trembled, basket nearly falling. She turned, gazed long, then dropped the basket outright and ran across the rows. Gideon strode forward. and in a breath she was in his arms. Dust, sweat, horse scent, all vanished in the press of his chest. "I missed you." Maren breathed against his shoulder, voice breaking. "I missed you too." "Every day, every night," Gideon answered, burying his face in her hair, breath ragged as though drawing life itself from her heartbeat. For that moment, the whole ranch stilled. Only the wind moved, and two souls clung as if nothing else remained. That night, after the meal of reunion, Gideon asked Maren to walk. Moonlight silvered the fields, guiding them to the eastern creek where water murmured over stone. They sat together, silence stretched. Gideon shed his gloves, his rough hand finding hers. She shivered, but did not pull away. He drew a deep breath, voice husky. "On the trail, I learned. I thought of nothing but coming back. Not the cattle, not the land. Only you." Maren turned, eyes wide, breath caught. "I love you, Maren," he said, words striking her like a hammer to the heart. "I loved you from the day you rose weak but unbroken in my room. From the moment you smiled by the stove, sowed seeds in the garden, told me your past. I cannot imagine this life without you." Tears streamed down Maren's cheeks, glistening on dark skin beneath the moon. Her voice broke. "You made me believe. I deserve happiness. After all I've lost, I never thought I could love again, or be loved." Gideon leaned close, their lips met. First a searching tremor, then deepening into the fierce tide of days apart. He pulled her to her feet, lifting her easily, carrying her back toward the ranch. Under the moonlight, she nestled against him, arms wound around his neck, her heart pounding wild. Behind his closed door, with firelight flickering faint across the walls, Gideon laid her down. His blue eyes burned as he bent for her lips again. This time there was no hesitation. The kiss was hungry, sure, his hands trailing her spine, pulling her close. Maren answered, breath tangled with his, chest rising quick with longing. Clothes slipped to the floorboards. His touch was strong yet tender, tracing every line, every shiver. She whispered his name, and the sound broke his restraint. That night they gave themselves again, but not as before. No storm to shelter from, no caution left. Only the wildfire of return, fierce and consuming, meant to fill the emptiness of their days apart. The wind outside joined their ragged breaths, the creak of wood under the weight of bodies bound tight. In his arms, Maren knew no fear, no hiding. She opened herself, gave all, and received all. Every touch, every kiss was a vow without words, that they belonged to each other, come what may. As night waned and moonlight dimmed at the window, Maren lay against Gideon's chest, her head rising with his steady heart. She closed her eyes, knowing that rhythm would be the companion to her own for all her days. And in the breathless hush, Gideon whispered, "You are my home, Maren." Through her tears, she smiled and whispered back, "And you are the reason I still believe in joy." That day arrived as quiet as an early autumn dawn. The wind drifted soft, carrying the scent of wildflowers from the fields beyond the ranch. Maren was gathering stems of golden white daisies to place in the clay jar on the kitchen table when Gideon called her name. She looked up. He stood on the gentle rise, tall against the clear sky. In his hand he held nothing more than a single purple bloom. Yet when Maren stepped closer, his eyes shone with a tender light, as if his whole life had led to this moment. "There's something I've carried too long," Gideon began, his deep voice unsteady, the flower turning between his large fingers. "Maren, I don't want you only as the woman beside me. I want you as my wife." Her breath caught. The prairie seemed to still, the wind itself pausing. In his steady blue eyes she saw nothing but truth. No fear of whispers, no weight of others' judgment. Gideon bent to one knee, the wildflower in place of a ring. "Will you walk the rest of this life with me?" Tears spilled as she raised a trembling hand to her mouth. A woman who had borne scorn, who once believed her fate was to linger at the margins, was being offered what every heart longs to hear. She nodded, laughing through her tears. "Yes, Gideon." "Yes." He rose and pulled her close, holding her as if the world might tear her away. In his arms, Maren knew she had not only been saved, she had been chosen, seen, and loved whole. News raced faster than prairie wind. The wedding of Gideon Hayes and Maren Johnson became the talk of Riverbend. Some were curious, some surprised, but most felt respect. Gideon was known as steadfast and just, and by choosing Maren, an African-American woman, his decision became its own declaration. The small wooden church at the town's center was dressed not in finery, but in meadow flowers, daisies, lavender, wild sprigs carried in by neighbors. On that day the sky turned bright and clear, the light falling wide across the weathered shingles. Maren wore a simple gown stitched by Mrs. Whitaker and a few townswomen. Ivory cloth, plain and true, with a sprig of blossoms in her hair. As she entered, hands gripping her bouquet, she felt the weight of every gaze. There was curiosity, there was wonder, but no contempt. For at the far end stood Gideon, his eyes alight with pride, fixed on her alone. At the altar, his hand closed over hers. The preacher spoke brief words, then left room for their own vows. Gideon's voice was husky but firm. "I promise you'll never stand alone, never face a fear without me, so long as I draw breath." Maren met his gaze, smiling through tears. "You showed me I was worthy of joy. Today I promise to guard that joy with you." Come storm or sun, the preacher's rare smile broke across his face. "Before God and this community, I declare you husband and wife." Applause filled the chapel. Shouts and blessings rose, but to Maren it all blurred, save for Gideon's arms, circling her waist and his lips finding hers in their first open kiss. It was not defiance, but proof. Their love was real, unshaken by barriers. The feast followed at the ranch. Neighbors brought pies, roasted meat, apple cider, and a fiddler's tune carried the dance into dusk. Maren spun with Gideon across the grass, hem brushing the earth, laughter spilling free. She was no longer the survivor, no longer the outsider. She was Gideon's wife, and more, she was wholly herself, standing strong where once she had trembled. From the porch, Mrs. Whitaker's eyes shone wet, her voice low to a friend beside her. "See there? Love knows its road. No one can bar its way." Later, under lantern lights strung along the fence, Gideon drew Maren away from the crowd, out to the quiet field. "Are you well?" he asked softly, searching her eyes. "More than well," she answered, voice shaking with certainty. "I never thought I'd see this day. To be loved, to stand with the man I chose, before the whole community." He kissed her brow. "Today's only the start." We have a lifetime yet to write. They held each other beneath the moon, the ranch warm behind, the wide prairie ahead, and between love at last accepted by all. That night, when the guests had gone and lanterns dimmed, Maren sat by her window, gazing out at the darkened fields. The moon traced her shadow across the earth, yet she no longer felt alone. Outside, Gideon's steps paused at her door. His arms slipped around her from behind. "Welcome home, my wife," he whispered. Maren closed her eyes, leaned against his chest, and smiled. At last, after all her wandering, she had found her true home. Years after the wedding, Maren and Gideon's life flowed not with clamor, but with the fullness of a steady river. The prairie stretched on as endless as ever, seasons turning in their quiet rhythm, new grass rising fresh and green after each spring rain. But at Hayes Ranch, the old cracks of loneliness had been replaced by laughter, by the quick steps of children across the porch, by the warm scent of bread drifting from the kitchen. Maren had turned into the heart of a home. Their firstborn, a boy named Elijah, carried his father's deep blue eyes, yet his smile bore his mother's warmth. Then came twin daughters, Ruth and Naomi, whose chatter and songs often shook the small wooden house with the force of their joy and quarrels. Each evening, Gideon lifted the youngest onto his shoulders while Maren clasped the hands of the others, and the family strolled along the fence line, letting the evening wind comb through their hair. The ranch grew prosperous. The cattle doubled, the horses thrived. The garden and chicken yard Maren tended became a pride of the homestead, no less than the open pastures. Yet what filled Maren's heart with gratitude was not plenty itself. It was the way Gideon's gaze never changed. He still looked at her as he had that first evening when he found her collapsed at his gate, as if she remained the most precious gift fate had placed in his hands. One spring, Gideon built a small wooden house at the edge of the wildflower field. Not a barn, not a shed, but a schoolroom. Pine benches lined up, a slate board on the wall, wide windows thrown open to sun and prairie breeze. When he led Maren there, he said nothing, only smiled. She stood still, heart tightening as though hearing the echo of her father's dream, the man who once longed to bring knowledge westward. She touched the desk, fingers trembling. "You built this for me?" Gideon shrugged, his deep voice low. "For you, for the children, ours and the others nearby. I know you've never stopped thinking about teaching." Tears brimmed as she folded into his arms. What she felt was not only a husband's love, but recognition. He had given her not just a home, but restored the dream she thought had been buried on that trail so long ago. When the school opened, families from miles around brought their children. They laughed as they scratched lessons on slate with chalk stones, smudging words, sometimes clumsy, but the light in their eyes told Maren her life was now whole. That evening, the sky glowed gold. Maren sat on the porch with Naomi asleep in her arms, while Ruth and Elijah raced across the yard, hair tangled in sunlight. Gideon walked back from the stable, shirt damp with sweat, eyes bright as he took in the scene. Maren looked at her children, at her husband, and whispered, not to anyone but to the wind, "This is home. This is where I belong." In those plain words lay the span of her journey. From a broken girl collapsed in Oregon Trail, dust, to wife, to mother, to teacher, loved, respected, whole. As the sun sank behind the mountains, setting the prairie aflame with color. Peace settled deep in her heart. That night, when the children slept, she stepped onto the porch. Gideon waited, cigarette ember glowing faint in the dark, his gaze fixed on the quiet fields. She sat beside him, resting her head on his shoulder. "I remember the first night here," she murmured. "I thought I was only sheltering for a while, that I'd leave when I could. But now—" He wrapped an arm around her, his voice rough but sure. "But you stayed. And because you did, this place became a home above them. The sky glittered with stars." On the porch, a man and woman sat in silence, bound not by words but by the simple nearness of hearts that had endured the storm and now could rest. And so Maren's story, from survivor to chosen to beloved to builder of a home, closed not with grandeur, but with the very thing she had longed for all her life. A quiet evening, a steady heartbeat beside her, and the certainty that she had, at last, found her true home. The road that carried them east began in a clear autumn. By then, Elijah was 10, Ruth and Naomi 8, their braids flying as they ran circles in the ranch yard. One evening at supper, Maren spoke of a letter she had received from her aunt in Boston, the only kin she had left. The woman was failing, and longed to see Maren's family once more. Gideon set his calloused hand on hers. "If you wish it, we'll go. It's time the children knew your roots didn't begin only out here." This journey was unlike any Maren had ever taken. No longer a girl staggering half-dead along the Oregon Trail, she now rode a long train with her husband and 3 lively children. Eyes still turned their way, a family of white and black bound together. But this time Maren did not lower her head. Gideon's steady hand rested at her back, and the children laughed without care, untouched by prejudice. Boston unfolded in brick and cobblestone, horse carts clattering, shops spilling noise and light. Maren held Ruth's hand tight. Memories stirred, years when every glance had measured her by skin and station. But she was no longer that girl. She walked now as wife, mother, and woman who had claimed her home. Her aunt embraced her with tears. "My child, I feared I'd never see you again." Her gaze passed to Gideon and the children. For a breath it faltered, then softened into a smile. "You have built what so many here only dream of." In Boston, they drew whispers, curious stares, muttered words, an occasional frown. Yet Maren felt their weight no longer. Each time she wavered, she found Gideon's steady look or the bright voices of the children, and she walked on. Elijah lost himself in the great bookshops, Ruth and Naomi in the markets. Gideon, at Maren's side, watched the bustling streets and murmured, "So many people, yet so cold." "I'd take the prairie wind any day," she laughed, agreeing in her heart. One afternoon, from her aunt's porch, Maren watched her children playing with the neighbors' youngsters. The first minutes had been awkward. Then laughter bridged the gap, and soon no lines divided them. Maren understood then. The next generation would write a different story, freer than the old. Her aunt clasped her hand. "You could stay, live near me, safe within the city." She paused, her eyes searching Maren's. "But I know your heart no longer belongs here." Maren nodded faintly, gaze on the red roofs burning in sunset. Truth rose within. The east could offer shelter, but only the west had given her life, freedom, and love. When they left Boston, boarding the long train once more, a few eyes still followed them. Maren smiled. She was no longer the girl who once flinched beneath such looks. She had lived, she had loved, she had built a home. As the wheels began to turn, Gideon laid his hand over hers, his voice low. You see, we've come full circle. But westward, that's where we belong. Through the window, the sky stretched wide. Elijah, Ruth, and Naomi slept tangled together, their hair a tangle of dreams. Maren smiled, tears sliding freely, not sorrow, but gratitude. Yes, she whispered, our home is where the wind runs free, where love is unchained. And the train carried them back to the prairie, back to the ranch, back to the true home of their lives. Perhaps, after all the miles, the story of Maren and Gideon was never only about two hearts finding each other, but about the slow and steady discovery of what it means to have a true home. When she first stumbled, half dead, on the trail's dust, Maren had no thought beyond survival. She carried only a silver locket, a memory of family, and the weight of loneliness that seemed boundless. Yet the West, harsh and unforgiving, offered her more than shelter. It placed in her path a man who saw her not as the world had judged her, but as she was, capable, brave, worthy of standing beside him. From that beginning of dust and silence, a life unfolded. Years later, the picture had changed entirely. No longer the frightened girl bent against the wind, Maren stood as a woman who had built with her own hands. She had planted rows of corn and beans, baked bread that filled a house with warmth, taught children their letters by the light of a kerosene lamp. She had raised sons and daughters whose laughter ran across the yard like a clear stream, each voice carrying the proof that hope, once thought lost, had taken root. And Gideon, steady, enduring, watchful, was there at every turning. His hands shaped fences and barns, yet more than that, they shaped a life with her. His eyes, once narrowed against the judgment of others, softened whenever they found her, as if to remind her that she had been chosen, not merely saved. What had begun as survival had ripened into belonging. Hayes Ranch was not only a spread of land or cattle counted in the fields. It was the echo of small feet on the porch, the hush of a prayer before supper, the quiet weight of Gideon's arm across her shoulders at the end of a long day. It was laughter shared in the kitchen, quarrels of children quickly mended, neighbors who came with bread and stayed to talk. It was, in every way, the shelter of spirit that Maren once thought was denied to her. And so, in the twilight of their years, one could look back and smile at the truth that runs through every life. Each of us carries a season of wandering, a stretch of road where dust blinds the eyes and loneliness presses down. But somewhere along that road, a hand may reach for ours. A glance may soften, unguarded, offering the silent promise that we do not walk alone. In that moment, no matter how ordinary, a home begins. That is happiness, not loud, not fleeting, but plain, steady, and enduring. If this story has stirred something in your heart, perhaps you too recall a time when you knew, with quiet certainty, this is home. This is where I belong. We invite you to share that memory in the comments below. And if these Wild West love stories have brought warmth to your evening, do not forget to like, to subscribe, and to ride along with us as we continue telling tales of love on the frontier, for all who still believe in its power.